If you invade a country, kill over 100,000 people, displace millions, cause havoc in the region, and torture people, of course you should be charged with war crimes. No, I'm not talking about Putin. I'm talking about Bush. Earlier this week marked the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, a disaster that has had serious repercussions on the international system and will likely see ripple effects for the next few decades. So let's take a moment to recall what happened 20 years ago, and what's happened since, and why the invasion of Iraq changed international relations perhaps permanently. After the attacks on September 11th, George W. Bush administration, led in part by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, with other figures like Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice playing an important role, started to make plans to invade Iraq. In fact, it was only hours after the attack on 9/11 that then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was already trying to determine how to justify taking Saddam Hussein out. As we now know, there was zero connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, or Osama bin Laden, and no connection between Saddam and the attacks on U.S. soil. Yet those pesky facts didn't stop the Bush administration from finding any way to exploit the 9/11 fear and fervor just to justify a war of aggression in Iraq. In the ultimate example of irony, while there was no connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq before the US invaded, our government's actions directly led to the creation of the Islamic State in Iraq and then the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIS. So not only was the war of aggression unjustified, we helped create the very thing we were supposedly fighting against. Now, I'm not going to rehash the entire lead up to the war, the lies about the weapons of mass destruction, which we never found, or the way our news media flat out failed at adversarial journalism and basically acted as a propaganda megaphone for the Bush administration. No, I want to talk about the ridiculous hypocrisy of calling for international justice for crimes committed by Russia and Ukraine, while barely anyone facing justice for the crimes that the US committed in Iraq and elsewhere. In Bush's address to the nation, announcing the start of the war in Iraq, he said this:
"In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality."
America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. That's interesting, considering the fact that the war in Iraq cost over 100,000 Iraqis their lives, with some estimates of war-related deaths in the hundreds of thousands. No regard for the conventions of war? What about the unknown number of people that were tortured at Abu Ghraib? Renditioned to black sites, disappeared, held indefinitely in places like Guantanamo Bay, which is still in operation, by the way, all of which were direct violations of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, and human rights law. Not to mention the war itself, a war of aggression that had no justifiable cause. Iraq was not an imminent threat to the United States. We were not acting in self-defense. It was not a justifiable war. Due to this war of aggression, in addition to the hundreds of thousands killed, and various war crimes and crimes against humanity, millions of Iraqis were forced to flee their homes. Many ended up internally displaced. Many became refugees in other countries. How many people have been held accountable for these crimes? Literally no one at the top. Not a single top-level administration official faced any repercussions for these crimes. Not one. It's an embarrassment of fantastical thinking to suggest that the United States is a leader in promoting accountability for mass atrocities, when we refuse to hold our own leaders accountable for the crimes that they committed. How can we expect to enforce the rule of law around the world when the United States thinks it's above the law? If we want to be a leader that promotes human rights, the rule of law, and a rules-based international order, then we have to abide by those same rules, laws, and norms. It's that simple.